Preparations advance very quickly for a special summit on Ukraine. Around 160 countries are invited to this event taking place in Switzerland this coming weekend. For Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, it's a week of intense diplomacy after a two-day Ukraine recovery summit in Berlin. There's the G7 coming up in Italy, and then the peace summit we've just been speaking about in Switzerland this coming weekend. So much at stake, much to do, and the war still continues. But that rebuilding is something that has been ongoing in Ukraine since the very start of Russia's full-on invasion and the destruction that they brought to the country. And here to talk a bit about what we've been hearing a little earlier in the week, we have an architect, Martin Duplantier, who is involved in the projects in Ukraine. Martin is here in the studio, so we're lucky to have this man present to give us his unique insight into what's happening. You've just attended this recovery summit in Berlin. I did. Which, there were so many questions on that. How are you taking part in this reconstruction project of Ukraine? It is a massive project. What's your role?
It's a massive project, but it's, let's say, we are in the reparation phase. We are in the emergency of the reconstruction. So when we're talking about reconstruction, we are talking about short, middle, and long term. And all of these temporalities have to articulate with one another. And that's part of our job at the moment.
So, for instance, people know that shot of the iconic bridge at Irpin, which was blown up by the Ukrainian troops to stop the Russian advance. We know that that has been reconstructed next to it, and the blown up bridge is being kept as a kind of memorial to that moment. But there are other projects across the country of a similar scale.
Yeah, and I would say that infrastructure is the first stone that you would like, to rebuild in a city. I'm in charge of cities like Izium, for example, which has been massively destroyed, and we are preparing the reconstruction of the city, which in the center it's about 80% of the buildings that have been damaged. And knowing that 40% of the population is still living in there, we need to put on paper actually the plans for the long term, while at the same time enabling current life, reconstructing the hospital, enabling children to go back to school, etc. So you see, it's about emergency, but it's also about anticipating the long term.
It's about giving that kind of sense of normality, isn't it, to kids? Because we've reported on underground schools in Kharkiv, where children are sheltering from bombs, but they're having classes underground. So they go underground, they don't see the daylight, they come back at the end of the day. It's a sad situation, but they're going to school, which is great. What you're trying to do is obviously sort of counteract all the damage that's been done to things like electricity infrastructure, those kind of things as well. This is a massive, massive scale.
It's a massive scale.
$480 million, the World Bank said it would cost.
Oh, yeah, the figures are enormous. 50% of all the electrical generators in power plants in Ukraine have been damaged. So you can imagine the massive investment, public but also private, that is needed. And such summits really help on that.
The man who was in charge of the rebuilding project when I was over there for the first year anniversary was Mustafa Nayem, who's just resigned. He says it's such a big project. He says the government's getting in the way. Do you have any light you can throw on that situation?
Well, it's a very domestic issue. I'm not well informed enough to share my views on this.
But you work closely with some very important people.
I do.
Can you tell us who they are?
Well, I work, for example, with the First Lady. We're initiating a project that we'll be happy to share in the near future.
Okay, so you can't tell us much on that. What's she like to work with?
She's dedicating a lot of time for children and for education. So that will be in this topic.
Okay. In terms of what happens on a day-to-day basis, how involved are you? How much will you be doing between now and next 5 years? How much are you going to stamp your mark on what happens?
Well, as for now, we're doing a lot of work through a charity fund based in Ukraine, in Lviv and in Southern Kyiv. And with a lot of Ukrainian architects that are part of this charity fund, we're assisting Ramadas, which is local community level, for the reconstruction. And in the next 5 years, well, I don't know where the war will be, of course. This depends a lot on these geopolitical issues, but reconstruction will be still going on and will hopefully pass from the emergency state to some kind of normality.
There is a huge danger in these kind of construction projects without a war going on, because clearly accidents happen on construction sites. But with the war in progress as well, it must make it 3 times, 4 times, 5 times more difficult, more dangerous to carry out even the basic things.
That's for sure. And it's also a challenge to get manpower for these reconstruction sites. You can't imagine even how difficult it is also to hire people in our proper studio. And you know, reconstruction eras have in the history of architecture often been the worst periods for urbanism and for heritage. So let's hope this time we can anticipate it and make it much better.
The very fact you're talking about it says that that process is already underway. Martin, thank you very much for being with us. We appreciate your time and that insight you're giving to us into what's happening in that section of Ukraine's crisis management right now. Martin Duplantier, architect involved in the reconstruction of Ukraine. Thank you, sir, for joining us here on France 24. We appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next,